I wanted to talk about some of the, almost the conflicting roles that budgets can have. On the one hand, we've talked about budgets being a mechanism or a means by which you can prudently anticipate the future. That's where we talked about reserves and contingencies. But at the same time, budgets have a management aspect. Sometimes they're intended to explicitly prompt a certain behavior on the part of people that work there, or induce people to do things, or setting goals in order to accomplish things. So let me just give you an example, say in fundraising, where the development staff is in charge of bringing in annual funds, which typically are used for budgetary purposes. And let's say every year they bring in a particular institution, $30 million in annual funds that are used for the budget. You may think, or the president and the provost may think, that they're not doing a very good job. And so you want to push them harder and expect them to raise more in annual funds. If, on the one hand, if you use the budget to induce them to create a goal for them to say, we're setting the hurdle higher for you, we really believe you need to do better, then you may decide that you want to push the revenue number up as an inducement or as an explicit goal for them. On the other hand, you do run into the problem then of possibly anticipating the future wrong. The prudent side of you might say, well, let's keep the annual fund low this year because we may not be able to meet it. So there to me is at least one example, and there are probably others, of the possible conflict between the use of the budget as a management tool and the use of the budget to sort of, if you will, prudently anticipate the future. Do you see that happening, and how do you manage those kinds of things?
That's a good question, and it's an ever-present issue in budgeting. Let's talk specifically about fundraising. The development office at NYU sets annual goals for itself, and the goals are built from the ground up, looking at different purposes that they would seek to raise money for example, financial aid, new construction, endowment for endowment for faculty, chairs. Their targets are set somewhat aggressively, and they're done that way deliberately to motivate their fundraising team. When I look at those targets, I will question them, challenge them, and do everything I can to try and satisfy myself that either the targets are realistic and are likely to be achieved, or have been set too aggressively. If they're set too aggressively, I will reduce them. But there are other dimensions to it. If there is a fundraising target for a particular activity, I will not allow the expense budget to be developed until we've seen evidence that the fundraising is going to be achieved. How else is the budget used to incentivize and motivate behavior? At NYU, the professional fundraisers are compensated in part on an incentive basis. That is, if they achieve their targets, they receive bonuses that are substantially greater than what the base salary is. And if they fail to achieve the targets, they don't get the bonus. In that sense, the university budget is no different from that of many commercial enterprises, where members of a sales team are compensated based on their success in sales.
Do you know how usual or unusual that is in a nonprofit higher ed context?
I think it's common in university development offices.
In the development offices, for that reason.
Right.
Because that's the part of the higher ed that is in which we bow to the commercial side and accept that it's not purely about the mission or about everybody doing a good job. There's a financial incentive to do a good job.
Correct.
Okay. Let's step back a bit and talk about the role of the budget. I mean, there's an overall business enterprise going on. money is coming in, money is going out.
Right.
And I know that every university is going to be somewhat different in terms of the money that it relies on and what it spends. But can you just draw a picture, as though it were a pie chart even, and talk about for a private university or public, whatever university you would care to talk about, where does the money come from and what is it spent on overall?
A pie chart is a very useful tool for illustrating the sources of support of a university, and also for illustrating how that support, once the money comes in, is expended. I like to think in terms of sources and uses. So the sources are tuition, are income from endowment, income from residence halls, income from sponsored research. Sponsored research is what we call the contract that is established between a government agency such as the National Institutes of Health and the faculty to conduct particular research. And when you look at the revenue pie chart and you compare different types of institutions, you'll see very different pictures. A very well-endowed Ivy League college or university will have a large portion of the revenue pie indicated as income from endowment, and a much smaller portion of the pie indicated as income from tuition. A tuition-driven university such as NYU will show close to 70% of the total revenue coming from what we call net tuition. And net tuition is an important concept. So net tuition is the gross tuition less... I'm sorry?
The sticker price.
The sticker price.
Yeah.
It's the sticker price, or the gross tuition and fees, less the amount of financial aid that the institution awards.
So it's thought of as a scholarship often from the point of view of the students, when in effect it's a form of price discount, saying, as though to say, the airfare is actually $1,000, but if you buy it today, it's going to be $500 for you. So it's a discount from the advertised price in effect.
Well, I like to think of it as being a little more complex than that. So you look at what are the reasons for financial aid. There are two types of financial aid. One is merit-based, which is a form of financial aid that is awarded or is offered to a prospective student based solely on her academic credentials. And another type of financial aid is need-based. And that is assuming that an individual meets the academic requirements of the institution. We then look at the ability of the student and her family to pay the cost of 4 years of college.
So at NYU, for instance, how much of, what's the difference between, if you will, the gross and net tuition? How deep is the level of aid or scholarship or discount?
Sure. Across all of our undergraduate programs, it averages about 22%. It ranges from a low in the teens to a high of 40%, depending on the school at NYU.
And why you mentioned endowment, a place like Harvard, which has presumably has a huge endowment and significant endowment per student.
Right.
How does that flow in? How does the nature of that endowment benefit the actual operating budget? Because I picture the endowment as if you will, a pot of wealth, which is sitting off to the side, and it may get bigger and bigger and bigger. How does that actually make its way into the operating budget for use?
The earnings from the endowment are what is used to support operations. And it's not all the earnings from the endowment. It's a plan to take earnings from the endowment that are limited such that the endowment will continue to grow through investment return, such that it will keep pace with inflation. So let me explain. So let's say that the endowment, through good investment, is able to grow by 6% per year. It's a very conservative figure, but over the long run, I think it's reasonable. And let's say also that inflation is running at 2% per year. So what you want to do is ensure that you do not take any more of the endowment's value than is necessary to allow the endowment to continue to grow to cover inflation.
But that's one of the reasons why people like their endowment to grow and grow, because even if you permit the endowment to sort of keep pace with inflation, the larger the endowment, the greater the flow in. You could then either use that to reduce tuition or, more likely, make a richer academic program?
It would be always a combination of the two.
Okay. Let's talk about different kinds of budgets. We mostly have been talking about the budget for the operating budget, a budget for salaries, for services, for equipment, for paper clips, for everything. And that takes place over these one-year cycles, let's say. It has this incremental quality where you picture a faculty member or a dean sort of saying, here's what I got last year, I want to make a pitch to hire new faculty for next year to grow the program. But there's this other entire part of the life of an institution in which is not as incremental, where it may be you need to build a big building or two big buildings or buy a fleet of trucks or replace some equipment. That's the capital budget, as I understand it. Can you talk about how that's different and how it plays into this question of both the process for approving it and the strategic issues?
The capital budget is typically characterized by what we call lumpy expenditures. That is, if you do have a fleet of service trucks on your campus, and the average useful life of those is, say, 7 years. So you know that every 7 years you're going to have to buy a fleet of these trucks. That's a lumpy expenditure. Or if you're building a building, you have to purchase the land, pay for the construction, and so forth. That's a lumpy expenditure. So what you may have in a large, complex institution is a series of those lumpy expenditures over time. And what you want to be able to do is to anticipate them and look as far out into the future as you reasonably can, probably 10 years, and understand when you are next going to have to lay out that kind of money. So there are different ways then of dealing with those lumpy expenditures. You can, from your operating budget, which is this annual budget that, as you pointed out earlier, tends to grow at a predictable rate year on year, you can take a portion of that operating budget and set it aside. And you may not spend it in the year in which you set it aside, but you're creating a fund that will allow you to, over time, build up enough money so that you can then pay for those lumpy expenditures. You may also decide that the only way you're going to be able to afford some of these big expenditures, such as a new building, is to borrow money, like getting a mortgage on a house. And so the institution or some agency that works on behalf of the institution will issue bonds. And those bonds will have a payment cycle associated with them. And you need to build that into your annual budget to pay the interest and the principal on the bonds.
Great. Let's return to this issue. Earlier on, you talked about budgeting at a place like NYU having both a top-down and a bottom-up quality. I'd like to explore what that means in practice. I think a lot of times people think about management or they think about an organizational chart and they see a pyramid in their head, right? They think that at the top of the pyramid there's a brain, and the brain then, whether it's a matter of ordering people around in terms of what they can do or what they must do in their daily job or what they should spend money on, everything flows from the top down. And in a small business, that may in fact be the way that it works, or the only way it works. But when you're dealing with something as large and complex, multifaceted and political as a large university, you have both a top-down and a bottom-up quality.
I think a better analogy in a university than a pyramid is an octopus.
Yeah.
An octopus has many arms, 8 arms, and the biologists tell us that there is intelligence in each of those arms. And so those arms are all working together to help support the entity, which is the octopus. There is a central part of the octopus, which is the administration of the university, with the provost and a president and a budget office and a chief financial officer. But without those arms playing an active role in conducting the mission of the university, contributing ideas to the enterprise, providing sources of support, of revenue, the octopus would not be able to survive.
So very interesting. The other, actually, it's interesting. Biologists also say that we think with humans too. Think with their gut. There's a certain portion of our brain,
Yes, right.
brains that are actually in our gut. So when we talk about gut instinct,
Right.
that's not just metaphorical. That not all of our own brain power, if you will, resides in the cranium, but some of it resides in other parts of our body.
Right.
So with that metaphor, octopus or brain, you don't have, if you will, a top-down organization. You have something in which the system has to cohere in some organized way. It's not disorganized. It's organized in its own fashion, recognizing the fact that there's brain power in those octopus legs.
And the budget is the tool that keeps the organization working in harmony. The budget is the tool that ensures that those parts of the organization that are responsible for revenue know what their revenue responsibilities are, and they're held accountable to meet them. And for every part of the organization, there is an expense budget, and that expense budget has limits on it. And so the deans or the unit heads know that they cannot spend any more than what their budget entitles them to. So the budget is a tool which keeps an organization, or helps to keep an organization operating smoothly and avoid chaos.
And does it do that? Does it work smoothly and avoid chaos?
It does.
In your experience?
It does.
That's great. Not perfect, but people often talk about, remember there's a famous line in government work about muddling through. People always think that they're going to do things perfectly, but in the final analysis, you have to sort of get by. But budget is, as I understand what you're saying, is it's you're trying to do better than just muddle through. You're trying to optimize something and try to manage through chaos.
And particularly when you view the budget not in isolation as a 12-month fiscal plan, but rather as part of a multi-year financial plan, which is tied to the strategic goals of the institution and is frequently reviewed by the president, the provost, the board, and is spoken about publicly, and there's transparency. The budget and its accompanying plan are very, very powerful tools for the good, for the health of the institution.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very helpful and illuminating. Thanks.